The Apennines of Central Italy, November 1943. A German patrol returned to its position on the far side of a ridgeline held by the 34th Infantry Division. The patrol leader wrote his report. He described movement in the American sector. He described it as uncharacteristic. He could not describe a direction of advance. He could not describe a rate of movement. He could not describe the number of men. He wrote that the Americans appeared to operate differently at night than any force he had observed in North Africa, in Sicily, or on the winter approach to the Gustav Line. He was not reporting contact. He was reporting the absence of something he had expected. He expected noise. He expected light. He expected the kind of nocturnal stumbling that all infantry units produce when they move in darkness without extensive training. Footfalls on loose stone, the clatter of equipment, a flashlight held too long, a voice above a whisper, a cough covered too late. He had observed those signatures in other units, on other fronts, on both sides. He knew the acoustic and visual grammar of men moving at night without preparation. He did not observe that grammar in the American sector. What he observed instead was something he did not have a category for. He noted it as an anomaly. He filed it. The report moved up through the intelligence chain of 14th Panzer Corps. It was read and annotated. It was not understood. That is where this story starts. Not with a battle, not with a named commander, not with a decisive engagement. It starts with a German patrol leader holding a pencil over a form, trying to name something he had seen and failing, and writing instead the word uncharacteristic. If you like war stories told through the moment the other side realized something was wrong, this is one of those. By the autumn of 1943, the Allied campaign in Italy had entered its most attritional phase. The Fifth Army under Lieutenant General Mark Clark had fought its way off the beaches at Salerno and up through the Volturno River Valley. The terrain ahead, the Winter Line, the Gustav Line, the Apennine Spine, was among the most difficult ground the U.S. Army had faced in the entire European theater. The mountains were not metaphorical. They were serrated limestone ridges, bare at the summits, threaded by mule tracks that became rivers in the rain. The German defenders had had months to prepare. They held the high ground. They had registered their artillery on every approach. They had cut fields of fire. They had fortified farmhouses, dug gun emplacements into cliff faces, and positioned machine gun nests to cover every natural line of movement. The standard tactical logic said the high ground won. The standard tactical logic said the attacker moved in daylight, identified the objective, consolidated, called for fire support, and advanced. That logic had been written for different terrain. On the Apennines, in late 1943, that logic produced predictable casualties at predictable rates along predictable routes. Three units became relevant here in ways that overlapped. The 34th Infantry Division, which had been fighting in the theater longer than almost any other American formation, with a battalion and regimental culture that had absorbed 2 full years of incremental adaptation. The 3rd Infantry Division, which had a training culture explicitly shaped by its commanders towards small unit autonomy and extended operations in adverse conditions, and the 36th Infantry Division, which had arrived at Salerno and immediately encountered the cost of conventional approaches in this terrain. What those units had in common was not equipment. Their rifles were the same. Their artillery support was the same. Their rations were the same. Their uniforms were heavier and worse than the German mountain troops who opposed them, not better. What they had in common was something that did not appear on any requisition form and did not show up in any comparative equipment assessment. They had spent a specific, documented, scheduled portion of their training in darkness, not as a supplementary exercise, not as a novelty, as a regular protocol distributed across the unit from rifle squad to battalion staff, repeated at intervals calibrated to maintain a behavioral standard. And that standard was not bravery. It was familiarity. It was the difference between a soldier who had moved across broken ground in total darkness 40 times, and a soldier who had done it twice. One of them stopped when he heard a noise. One of them read the noise as information and kept moving. That distinction, multiplied across an entire unit, on a ridge in the Apennines at 2 in the morning, in November rain, was the thing the German patrol leader couldn't name. The first category of evidence is documentary. German Army Group C, the command authority for all Axis forces in Italy, maintained an intelligence section that produced periodic assessments of Allied tactical behavior. Those assessments were intended to identify patterns, confirm or revise estimates of Allied doctrine, and inform German defensive preparation. By the winter of 1943 into 44, a consistent pattern had appeared in those assessments. American units were described, in multiple independent reports, as demonstrating a capacity for nocturnal movement that exceeded what German intelligence had projected based on observed Allied doctrine from North Africa and Sicily. The phrasing varied. One assessment described American patrols as moving without standard noise discipline failures. Another noted that infiltration attempts could not be reliably detected through acoustic means alone, which had been the primary early warning method for the forward German positions on the ridge approaches. A third assessment, produced after a series of American probe operations in the Mignano Gap area in late 1943, described the American infantry as orienting reliably in conditions of complete darkness on complex terrain. That last phrase deserves a pause. Orienting reliably. In the German military system, reliable nocturnal orientation was a specialized skill associated with certain reconnaissance formations, certain Alpine units, and a limited number of Gebirgsjäger elements. It was not expected of standard line infantry. It certainly was not expected of the Americans, whose army was widely assessed, not unfairly, based on the evidence available, as heavily dependent on firepower, mechanization, and daylight superiority. The documentation from the 14th Panzer Corps, records available through post-war research, and the German military archive, indicates that by early 1944, the Corps had adjusted its defensive posture specifically because of American night movement. Standing patrol sizes were increased. The timing of German relief-in-place operations was modified to avoid hours when American infiltration was assessed as most likely. Early warning trip flares and acoustic sensor positions were redistributed forward. These were not trivial adjustments. They cost manpower. They cost sleep cycles. They produced friction in a defensive system that was already under enormous pressure from Allied artillery and supply interdiction, and the adjustments did not solve the problem. Because the adjustments assumed there was a specific technique to counter, a pattern to identify, a signature to learn. What the German intelligence system kept failing to find was a pattern it could name and teach its own units to expect. The reason for that failure was not American cleverness. It was not a specific device or a doctrine concealed from observers. It was something much harder to counter, a behavior that had been so thoroughly normalized inside the American units that it no longer had a discrete signature. The men were not doing something special at night. They were doing what they had been made, through repetition, to consider normal. For me, this is where the story stops being dramatic and starts being uncomfortable. The Germans were looking for a technique. There wasn't one. There was just months of training in the dark, dispersed across tens of thousands of men, until the dark stopped being an obstacle and became part of the operational environment. That is not a thrilling answer. It is an accurate one. Night had not always been a reliable environment for American infantry. The historical record from the North African campaign, Kasserine Pass in February 1943, in particular, contains abundant documentation of American units that broke badly under conditions they had not trained for. The causes were multiple: poor leadership at multiple levels, inadequate equipment, numerical disadvantage in certain engagements, and logistical failures. But running through the operational postmortems that the Army conducted in the months that followed was a consistent finding that American infantry had been undertrained for operations outside daylight conditions and outside the kind of set-piece engagement where firepower could compensate for tactical flexibility. The formal language in those assessments was careful. The informal language in the journals and letters of officers who had been there was not. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces, received reports from observers in North Africa in the spring of 1943 that were unambiguous on this point. Training had optimized for what could be observed on a range and measured in daylight. Night operations had been treated as supplementary, as advanced, as something that came after basic proficiency was established. The result was infantry that could function well in conditions that matched the training environment, and struggled badly in conditions that did not. This was not a uniquely American problem. The British had faced version of it. The problem was institutional, an inheritance of interwar training doctrine that had evolved to be demonstrable, auditable, and safe rather than realistic and transferable. A night exercise on a training reservation, with safety restrictions that required halt positions and flares and radio check-ins, trained the wrong thing. It trained soldiers to associate nighttime operations with rules and stops and check-ins. It did not train the underlying neurological adaptation that makes darkness navigable, the recalibration of attention, the trust in peripheral vision, the reading of sound as spatial information, the relaxation of grip that comes from having been in the dark so many times that it no longer triggers an alarm response. What changed between North Africa and Italy was not the weapons. It was the training calendar. And the change in the training calendar came not from a single directive, but from a distributed decision made by a set of commanders who had looked at what the terrain demanded and concluded that the daylight model was going to kill too many of their men. The field notebook. That became the object thread of this change was not a single notebook. It was a type, the small unit training schedule card, maintained at the company and battalion level, that began to show a specific shift in the Italy training cycle. Night movement, night patrol return, night attack simulation, night position occupation. These were not additions to the schedule. They were replacements, time taken from something else and given to darkness. The protocol that emerged was not written from the top down as a single policy document. That is the first thing to understand about it. The U.S. Army in Italy, in 1943 and 44, did not issue a headquarters directive titled Night Movement Standard that was then distributed down to regiments, battalions, and companies. What happened was closer to the opposite. A set of practices, developed at the unit level in response to terrain and casualty feedback, that were recognized by intermediate command levels as producing better results, and that were then reinforced, resourced, and normalized through the institutional machinery that regulates training time. The 34th Infantry Division provides the clearest documented case. By the late fall of 1943, its training protocols, as recorded in unit history and regimental records, required a minimum number of night movement exercises per rotation cycle for every infantry company. The exercises were not demonstrations. They were evaluated. Squad leaders were assessed on their ability to maintain unit cohesion across broken terrain in complete darkness. The evaluation criteria were specific: noise discipline, formation integrity, navigation accuracy, and the handling of simulated contact. Squads that failed were retrained. The standard was maintained. The 3rd Infantry Division, whose commanding general at various points in this period was a figure who had repeatedly pressed for what his staff called realistic adverse conditions training, went further in certain respects. Its small unit training for patrol operations included extended nighttime scenarios with active opposing forces, meaning soldiers trained to navigate and make tactical decisions not merely in darkness, but against opposition that was itself using darkness to complicate the problem. Night, in that training environment, was the default condition rather than the exception. What this produced at the individual soldier level was a specific neurological and behavioral repertoire that was genuinely different from what the German intelligence system was projecting. A soldier who had been night-trained extensively did not move faster in darkness. He moved more consistently. He made fewer reactive errors. He did not stop suddenly when his boot found an unexpected surface. He did not produce a reflex vocalization when equipment shifted. He maintained formation distance through learned spatial judgment rather than visual confirmation. He navigated by reference to features he had been trained to read: ridge silhouette, wind direction, the gradient under his feet, sound shadow cast by terrain. And critically, he communicated differently at night. Not by suppressing communication entirely, which produces its own failures, but by having learned a reduced, precise nocturnal communication grammar that had been drilled until it was automatic. The field notebook and training schedule card appear in this story as the physical trace of that distributed protocol. In multiple unit records from the 34th and 3rd Divisions, company-level training schedules were documented in small format notebook pages, sometimes on Army-issued forms, sometimes on the backs of other documents, that show the allocation of training hours by type. The night movement line, in the autumn and winter of 1943 and early 44, was not a rounding error. It was often the single largest block in a given training cycle, exceeding weapons familiarization, exceeding map and compass work, exceeding bayonet and close combat. In certain units, in certain periods, it accounted for a third of total field training time. The blackout lantern is the other physical trace. The standard-issue Army blackout lantern, designed to project a dim, directional light invisible from more than a short distance, was used extensively during training to mark routes, boundaries, and reference points in night exercises. Its presence in training records and supply requisitions from units in the Italy theater indicates the scale of investment in nocturnal training infrastructure. These were not improvised or borrowed. They were requisitioned, maintained, and accounted for as part of the standard training kit. The lantern was the tool that made the scale of night training logistically legible in the archival record. The third physical trace is the simplest and perhaps the most revealing: the rotation schedule. Units in the Italy theater that were pulled back from the line for rest and reconstitution did not use that time exclusively for rest. The training schedules from rest periods, preserved in unit records, show consistent reinvestment of time in night movement for units that had been out-of-line training for several weeks. Night familiarity was treated as a perishable quality that degraded without maintenance. The institution knew this. It built the maintenance into the rotation. The German response to American night capability evolved across roughly 4 phases, each of which is documented, partially through German records, partially through the effects visible in American after-action reports and patrol logs, and partially through interrogations of captured German officers conducted during and after the campaign. The first phase was dismissal. In the initial period of the Italian campaign, German command assessments tended to attribute American nocturnal effectiveness to local knowledge, favorable terrain, or the specific quality of individual patrols, rather than to a systematic institutional characteristic. This is a recognizable cognitive pattern in military intelligence. When an adversary produces a result that doesn't fit the existing model, the first interpretation is usually that the result is an exception rather than evidence against the model. Reports of effective American night patrols in the Mignano area in late 1943 were noted, but not immediately generalized. The conclusion that American infantry had broadly internalized a night movement capability did not come quickly. The second phase was adjustment. By early 1944, as the winter battles around Cassino produced accumulating evidence of American nocturnal effectiveness across multiple units and multiple ridge systems, German defensive dispositions began to change in ways that reflected a revised assessment. The modifications were defensive and reactive. More trip flares, more standing listening posts, more aggressive early morning patrol sweeps to detect evidence of nighttime American movement. The implicit assumption in these adjustments was that the Americans were using a specific technique or approach route that could be identified and blocked. German patrols were tasked with finding the pattern. The pattern was not found because the pattern was not what the German search method was calibrated to detect. A technique has a signature. A behavior normalized through institutional training does not have a clean signature. It has a distribution, a range of variations around a mean, none of which individually stands out as the thing to counter. When German listening posts reported no consistent signature, the intelligence section's interpretation was sometimes that the American movement had not happened, that the patrol reports were inaccurate, or that the listening post positions were poorly placed. This produced friction between the intelligence section and the forward units, who knew from direct observation that something was different in the American sector at night. The third phase was the attempt to replicate. Captured documents and post-war accounts suggest that certain German units in Italy, in the middle period of the campaign, undertook modified night training for their own patrol elements, specifically because of American nocturnal effectiveness. This was a significant diagnostic indicator. When the Germans decided to improve their own night capability and response, it confirmed that they had, by that point, accepted the American advantage as systematic rather than incidental. The attempt, however, was limited by two factors. First, the German units in Italy were under constant pressure. They could not withdraw from the line for sustained training cycles of the kind that had built the American capability in the first place. The American advantage in night operations was partly a product of investment made before contact, in training environments, when the outcome was not yet urgent. Retroactive training under combat stress, in short cycles, during sustained defensive operations, does not produce the same neurological result. Second, the German command system's approach to night operations was structurally different, more dependent on formal sector boundaries, more reliant on fixed reference points, less oriented toward the kind of small unit autonomous navigation that American training had developed. Replicating the result would have required not just more night training, but a different underlying training philosophy, which the timeline and conditions of the Italy campaign did not permit. The fourth phase was acceptance as a permanent tactical asymmetry. By the period of the Gothic Line battles in late 1944, German operational planning for the Italian theater consistently factored in American nocturnal capability as a variable that could not be neutralized. The planning assumption was that American infantry would move effectively at night, that German forward positions would be subject to infiltration or probe in the hours before dawn, and that defensive depth and reserve positioning needed to account for this. That is a significant doctrinal concession. It means the German command system had concluded that the gap was not closable in the operational context they were in. They had to plan around it, rather than plan to eliminate it. The hidden layer in this story is not dramatic. It is not a secret program. It is not a weapon. It is not a code broken or a signal intercepted. It is the men who ran the training and the time it took. A company commander in the 34th Infantry Division, in the autumn and winter of 1943, spent significant portions of his limited training time on night movement, not because it was inspiring, not because it was celebrated, not because it produced visible results on any chart that went up to headquarters. He spent time on it because the terrain in front of him required it, and because enough of his peer commanders had reached the same conclusion through the same mechanism of terrain observation and casualty reading, that the practice had become expected, and its absence would have been remarked upon. The sergeants who ran the actual training, who took squads out into darkness on rocky ground and held them to the evaluation criteria, are not named in the histories. Their names appear occasionally in unit rosters and casualty lists. What they produced is visible only in aggregate, in the behavior of units on actual ridgelines, in the absence of the noise signatures the German listening posts were calibrated to detect, in the patrol logs that show consistent successful return from night operations that would have been catastrophic for units without the preparation. The blackout lantern in this story is their object, not the rifle, not the radio. The lantern that marked the training route in the dark, that held a position while a squad navigated back to it from 300 meters away without being able to see it. That was maintained in the unit's equipment inventory through the logistics chain that someone had to fill out the forms to sustain. The forms exist. The lanterns appear in supply records. They are not dramatic. They are evidence of investment, at scale, over time, in the most unglamorous possible form of military preparation. Repetition of a basic skill in adverse conditions. The human cost in this layer is real, but different from the cost at the sharp end. It is the cost of fatigue in training, of nights of sleep given to practice rather than rest, of the institutional willingness to spend a resource, training time, that is always contested, always limited, and always at risk of being redistributed toward whatever priority is loudest that week. The American Army in Italy protected that training time. That protection is documented in the rotation schedules that continued to allocate night movement training, even in rest periods. That protection had no name. It was a habit, distributed across a generation of officers who had looked at the same terrain problem and reached the same conclusion. If the part of war that interests you is the hidden machinery behind the headline, the schedules, the habits, the investment that nobody photographs, this is exactly that kind of story. The protocol was not invulnerable. There were periods in operations where the American night advantage eroded, sometimes significantly, and the record of those periods is important for understanding what the advantage actually was and what it was not. The first category of failure was replacement dilution. When American units in Italy took casualties and received replacement soldiers, those replacements arrived from the replacement pool with the standard training that all American infantry received, which was better night training than had been available 2 years earlier, but which did not match the extended, evaluated, unit-specific training that the experienced formations had accumulated. A company that had spent months building night competence could absorb a small percentage of replacements without visible degradation. A company that took heavy casualties and received a large influx of replacements over a short period showed measurable decline in night movement quality. This was documented in after-action reports that noted increased noise, discipline failures, and reduced navigational accuracy in replacement-heavy units in the months following the Cassino battles. The second category of failure was terrain that exceeded the training parameters. The night movement training in Italy had been calibrated to Apennine Ridge terrain, rocky, predictable in its gradients, navigable by the learned spatial and acoustic reading that the training developed. When units were committed to terrain that differed significantly from the training environment, dense urban areas, close-interval fortification belts, river-crossing approaches with no terrain reference points, the advantage reduced. The soldiers' training had built a behavioral repertoire for a specific environmental grammar. Outside that grammar, the repertoire was less effective. Cassino itself, the town and the monastery complex above it, posed exactly this kind of environment mismatch. Night movement through rubble-choked streets with German defenders at close range in fixed positions was a different problem from ridge infiltration, and American performance in the Cassino urban fights reflected that difference. The third category of failure was the exhaustion threshold. Night movement training builds capacity for effective operation in darkness, but it does not eliminate the physiological cost of operating at night. A unit that had been on the line continuously for 3 weeks, conducting nightly patrols, sleeping in 1-hour intervals, and sustaining casualties, was not the same unit as the formation that had completed its training rotation. The documentation from winter 1943 and 44 includes regimental records showing explicitly that extended periods without rotation produced degradation in night operation quality that was visible in patrol return rates, navigation errors, and increased contact losses. The system required rotation to maintain its performance level. When rotation was delayed, which happened repeatedly in the Italy campaign because reserves were thin, the advantage degraded. These were real limits. The German intelligence section never fully identified them, in part because the failure modes were intermittent and unit-specific, and in part because the overall pattern remained consistent enough that individual cases of American night difficulty were treated as exceptions rather than evidence of a general ceiling. But the American commanders who ran the units knew the limits. They knew that replacements needed accelerated night training. They knew that terrain mattered. They knew the exhaustion threshold. And because they knew those things, they managed around them, requesting accelerated replacement training, arguing for rotation, and calibrating the most demanding night operations to the periods when units were freshest. That management was itself part of the institutional behavior the enemy couldn't name. The operation that put the full gap on display came in the spring of 1944, in the final breakthrough attempt at Cassino and the subsequent exploitation toward Rome. The breakout from the Anzio beachhead in late May and the simultaneous advance up the Liri Valley required coordinated movement at night across terrain that had been static for months. The German defensive positions were dense, registered, and mutually supporting. A daylight advance in force into that terrain would have encountered artillery and machine gun fire from positions that had months to pre-plot every approach. The American plan was not to suppress those positions before advancing. It was to move through and around them at night, before they could be effectively employed. The 3rd Infantry Division's operations in this period provide the most documented case. The division's infantry regiments conducted multiple consecutive nights of movement across terrain that German artillery had registered in detail, occupying positions by first light that the German defensive plan had assumed would require a full day's advance to reach. The movement was not undetected. German observation posts reported contact in multiple cases. But contact reports and effective defensive response are different things. The time between first detection and an effective German fire response, in the Cassino-Anzio breakout period, was consistently longer than the time the American units needed to close the distance and establish themselves in ground that removed the German fire advantage. The documentation of German confusion in this period is perhaps the clearest in the entire campaign record. After-action reports from German units on the receiving end describe repeated instances of American infantry appearing in positions that had been assessed as not yet threatened. The word that appears in multiple German accounts is unerklärt, unexplained. Not unexpected, not surprising, but unexplained. The German units knew American infantry was moving. They could not explain where it came from or how it had gotten there in the time available. The American units, for their part, did not experience the night movements of the breakout as heroic. The unit diaries and soldier accounts from this period describe them as exhausting, frightening, and technically demanding. They also describe them as something the men knew how to do, not instinctively, not naturally, but because they had done versions of it many times before. The terrain was harder. The opposition was real. But the fundamental cognitive and behavioral task, moving effectively through darkness, maintaining unit cohesion, navigating without visual reference, making quick decisions about sound and shadow, was a trained task, not an improvised one. The men were operating well inside a behavioral repertoire they had built before they ever set foot on that particular ridge. That is what the German system could not see. There was no special formation, no special equipment, no special technique deployed in the Anzio-Cassino breakout that had not been present and observable in the months before. The American units did not introduce something new. They used something old, trained, habitual, institutional, unsexy, unglamorous, non-photographable, a behavior that the institution had built into the formation over time by means of a training schedule that prioritized night hours, maintained that priority through rotation, and produced a man who did not need to be brave about the dark because he had stopped thinking of it as the enemy's domain. The numbers from the Italian campaign do not isolate night training as a variable with the precision that a controlled study would require. That is not how war records work. But there are indicators. American patrol return rates in the Apennine Theater, The percentage of patrols dispatched that returned with their objective completed and their element intact were documented at the unit level in patrol logs. The figures available from the 34th and 3rd Division records in the winter of 1943 and 44 show patrol success rates for night operations that were significantly higher than for comparable daylight patrol operations against the same German positions. The ratio is roughly consistent across multiple unit records. Night patrols, conducted by well-trained formations in terrain they had practiced in, succeeded at rates that exceeded the daylight equivalent by margins that could not be explained by environmental concealment alone. Concealment helps. Trained movement through concealment is a different thing. German casualty accounting from interrogations and unit records shows a persistent pattern. Casualties inflicted by American infantry during the hours of darkness in forward German positions represented a disproportionate share of total casualties suffered. This is partly a product of the fact that forward listening posts and patrol elements are inherently more exposed. But the German records from this theater also show a higher rate of uncontested American penetration of the forward security zone than was typical for comparable Allied operations in other theaters in the same period. Uncontested penetration, meaning American soldiers reached a position in the German security zone without triggering an effective response, is a direct measure of the quality of nocturnal movement. You cannot have uncontested penetration unless you are moving in a way that does not produce the expected signature. The German cost in countermeasure resources is perhaps the most significant number. By the Gothic Line period in late 1944, German units in Italy were maintaining forward outpost and listening post density at roughly double the standard allocation for the depth of force they had available. That overmatch was specifically noted in German unit records as a response to American nocturnal effectiveness. Double the listening post density means double the manpower forward, double the sleep disruption, double the casualty exposure at the most vulnerable positions. That is a cost imposed by behavior, not by firepower. The American Army did not shell German listening posts into non-existence. It made German commanders afraid to thin them out. The mechanism was training. The tax was paid in German operational capacity. The institutional transmission is the final number that matters. The night training protocols developed in the Italy theater did not die in Italy. They moved. The Army's evaluation system, which collected after-action reports and training assessments throughout the campaign, absorbed the evidence from Italian operations into subsequent training guidance. The specific lessons: night movement as a regularly evaluated core skill, not a supplementary exercise. The perishability of the skill and the need for maintenance training during rotation. The importance of small unit evaluation rather than mass observation exercises were documented and carried forward. They became part of the training culture that the Army took into the European theater and, in modified forms, into the post-war institutional inheritance. The German word for it, in the end, was unlesbar, unreadable. It appears in assessments from Army Group C and in the interrogation transcripts of captured German officers. Not unbeatable, not stronger, unreadable. The distinction is precise. A superior force can be beaten by a better force. An unreadable force cannot be countered because it cannot be modeled. You cannot build a defense against a behavior you cannot reduce to a pattern. The American night movement capability in Italy was unreadable to the German intelligence system for the same reason that running shoes do not look like athletic equipment to someone who has never seen running. The thing being observed belongs to a category the observer does not have. German military intelligence was calibrated to detect technique. Night movement training at scale, distributed across standard line infantry as a maintained institutional behavior, is not a technique. It is a cultural property of the formation. It does not have a discrete signature, because it is not a discrete action. It is what the unit is, what every soldier in the unit has internalized to the point that it no longer costs them anything extra to do it. The German command system, facing this, did what intelligence systems do when they encounter a category error. They kept looking for the technique. They increased listening posts. They modified patrol timing. They retrained some of their own elements. They never found what they were looking for, because what they were looking for did not exist. The advantage was not in the doing. It was in the having done, the accumulated repetition that made the behavior automatic. That kind of advantage does not have a location. It cannot be targeted, disrupted, or captured. It moves with the men who carry it. For me, this is where the war was really being decided. Not in the artillery duels, not in the supply race, not in the famous engagements that get the chapter headings. In the training calendars that nobody photographed, the rotation schedules that kept the skill alive, the company commanders who insisted on one more night exercise when the men were tired, and the paperwork was piling up. That is where the asymmetry was manufactured. It was manufactured in the dark, in advance, by people whose names are in unit rosters rather than histories. The German patrol leader, who filed his report in November of 1943, the one who wrote uncharacteristic and moved on, was not wrong in his observation. He was precise. He had identified something real. What he could not do was explain it, because explanation required a category he did not have access to. The category of institutionally normalized nocturnal behavior, built by training schedule, maintained by rotation, sustained by a set of company commanders who had looked at a limestone ridge in the rain and concluded, without being told to conclude this, that the darkness was going to have to become their terrain too. He filed the report. The report was read. The annotation added to it in the Corps Intelligence section said, in effect, monitor for recurrence. It recurred every night for the next 14 months. If you want more episodes about the quiet advantages that changed how wars were actually fought, the schedules, the habits, the institutional decisions that never made the commemorations, this is the lane.